Mark Hale had always been a dependable, albeit quiet, figure in the competitive world of finance. As a senior consultant at Grayson Keene Investments in London, he'd worked his way up through long nights, adapting to every shifting demand with careful diligence. But he'd never quite gained the respect of his peers. And with Victor Keene, the intimidating CFO, as his boss, that respect seemed farther out of reach than ever. Mark's wife, Emma, was the one light in his life that made the grinding routine bearable. As a PR manager for a luxury brand, she had her own fair share of stress. But she'd always been the stronger, more social one of the two, a quality that often left Mark feeling inadequate. Emma was supportive, though, always encouraging him to push forward, even when he felt like he was under Victor's thumb. And lately, that weight had grown heavier. Victor Keene was a name that commanded attention. Tall, refined, and sharp-eyed, he had an aura of control that made people straighten up in his presence. To Mark, he was a tyrant whose relentless demands kept him trapped in late hours at the office and subjected to subtle jabs that struck deep. But for Emma, the situation was different. She only knew Victor by reputation until one particular night at a corporate event changed everything. It was the annual fundraiser for Grayson Keene, held at the elegant Grosvenor House on Park Lane. Mark had reluctantly brought Emma along, hoping a night out could offset the draining effect Victor had on him. As the night wore on, Mark found himself cornered by Victor in a tense conversation about his latest project, leaving Emma to fend for herself among the crowd. Emma, with her charm and wit, was quickly noticed. When Victor finally approached her, she felt a thrill she hadn't expected. Their conversation was light at first, small talk about the event and her job in PR. But as they spoke, Emma felt Victor's gaze linger in a way that made her heart pound. Unlike Mark, Victor exuded confidence and control, a presence that was almost hypnotic. Mark might have been her husband, but Victor, he was something else entirely. Days after the event, Emma found herself thinking about Victor. She rationalized it as mere curiosity. After all, this man was the source of her husband's frustrations. Getting to know him could help her understand Mark's world better. But as weeks passed, these thoughts grew into something more. When Victor invited her out for a casual coffee under the guise of discussing a PR project, she accepted, telling herself it was harmless. Their first few meetings were just that, simple, innocuous conversations that Emma convinced herself were entirely above board. But Victor's charm and influence were undeniable, and each encounter drew her in further. Mark remained oblivious, his suspicions yet to awaken, as his wife and boss became entangled in a dangerous web. Soon, Emma's curiosity evolved into attraction, and her attraction into a full-fledged affair. Victor was powerful, decisive, and he made her feel alive in a way Mark hadn't in years. She knew it was wrong, but justified her actions by telling herself that Victor understood her in ways Mark didn't. She convinced herself she was doing it for Mark's sake, learning about the man who controlled his career, but deep down she knew it was a hollow excuse. It wasn't long before Mark noticed subtle changes in Emma. She started coming home later, her phone always in her possession, and she seemed more distant, her warm laughter replaced by preoccupied silence. Mark tried to ignore his growing unease, chalking it up to his own insecurities, but the feeling gnawed at him. Then came the night that shattered everything. Victor had arranged for Emma to meet him at his penthouse under the pretense of celebrating a promotion he was considering for Mark. Emma, though wary, was intrigued. She dressed carefully, her mind swirling with thoughts of what the evening might hold. When she arrived, Victor was waiting with a drink in hand, his eyes tracing her every movement. They exchanged pleasantries, but the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken intentions. As the night progressed, Victor's demeanor shifted. His charm faded, replaced by something darker. When Emma tried to pull away, he grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard. She was taken aback, stammering her discomfort, but Victor only tightened his grip, his expression cold and unyielding. What had begun as a forbidden thrill quickly transformed into a nightmare. She struggled, her pleas falling on deaf ears as Victor's grip grew more forceful, his control absolute. The room, once an alluring escape, now felt like a prison. She fought, but he was relentless, overpowering her as he forced her into submission, ignoring her cries. The brutality of his assault left her battered, both physically and emotionally. By the time he released her, she was left broken, her sense of security and dignity shattered. Emma staggered home, her mind reeling from the trauma. She couldn't bring herself to tell Mark the full extent of what happened. Her guilt over the affair mixed with shame and horror, creating a crushing silence. But the wounds, both visible and hidden, were there, and she knew she could never undo what had happened. Mark, oblivious to the dark turn of events, only saw his wife's haunted expression and distant demeanor. He felt betrayed by the coldness between them, but couldn't begin to understand the true depth of her pain. Over the following days, Emma's silence spoke volumes, and Mark's suspicions grew sharper. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't have anticipated the horror that lay beneath. Mark's suspicions had grown impossible to ignore. Emma's vacant eyes, her sudden withdrawal from him, and the unexplained bruises he'd glimpsed in fleeting moments haunted him. He'd asked her what was wrong, but her evasive responses only fueled his anger. Mark's love for Emma had been unwavering, and the growing distance between them was tearing him apart. One evening, he couldn't contain his frustration any longer. "Emma," he said, his voice tense, "I know something's going on. I can't keep pretending everything is fine." Emma looked up, eyes red and swollen. Her mouth opened to speak, but her words caught in her throat, tangled in fear and shame. Finally, she took a deep breath and, trembling, confessed to the affair. She admitted meeting Victor in secret, but the truth that followed hit Mark like a physical blow. When she described how the affair had turned violent, his heart shattered. The love he'd felt for her was eclipsed by a blinding fury, a sense of betrayal so deep it made him shake. But when she recounted the brutal assault, anger and disbelief coalesced into something darker. Victor had taken more than his wife's loyalty. He'd taken her dignity, her sense of self. Mark's heart burned with the need for justice. Fueled by rage, Mark stormed out of the house and drove to the office, where Victor was often found late into the night. The office was nearly empty when he arrived, his footsteps echoing down the sterile, carpeted corridors. The reception desk sat empty, and only the low hum of machinery filled the silence. Mark made his way to Victor's corner office, his hand clenching the doorknob as he fought to steady his breathing. Victor was seated at his desk, phone in hand, when he looked up. "Mark," he said, his tone laced with surprise and something closer to amusement, "what are you doing here at this hour?" Mark shut the door behind him, his eyes fixed on the man who had ruined his life. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Victor smirked, leaning back in his chair. "About what?" "The promotion," he taunted, his voice dripping with arrogance. Mark's fists clenched. "Number. About Emma." At the mention of her name, Victor's smirk faded, replaced by a look of disdain. He shrugged. "Your wife came to me, Mark. I didn't force her into anything." Mark's vision blurred with rage. "You assaulted her," he yelled, his voice reverberating off the walls. "You took everything from us." Victor's smile was cold, unfeeling. "What's done is done. You'll have to get over it, Mark. People like you, you're just not cut out for the real world." Those words ignited something primal in Mark. He lunged at Victor, his fists crashing down as years of pent-up anger and frustration poured out in violent blows. Victor tried to fight back, but Mark was relentless, the weight of his betrayal fueling every strike. In the chaos, Mark grabbed a heavy paperweight from the desk and swung it with all his strength. It struck Victor's head with a sickening crack, sending him reeling back, blood streaming down his face. But Mark didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The rage had taken over, blinding him to everything but the need to end the pain Victor had caused. Each strike was a release, a purging of the years of torment he'd endured under Victor's control. By the time he stepped back, panting and covered in blood, Victor lay motionless, his once arrogant face unrecognizable. The horror of what he'd done settled in slowly, creeping into his consciousness as the adrenaline ebbed. Mark looked around the office, the walls splattered with blood, the floor a grim testament to his actions. His hands shook as he backed away, struggling to breathe. He turned and stumbled out of the office, his mind racing. He knew there was no going back now. The life he'd known, the life he'd tried so hard to salvage with Emma, was gone. Back at home, Emma sat curled up on the sofa, her face pale and streaked with tears. She looked up as Mark entered, the blood on his clothes confirming her worst fears. "What did you do?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Mark couldn't find the words to answer. He sank into a chair, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical force. The silence between them was thick, heavy with the unspoken truth of what had just transpired. The next morning, news of Victor's death spread through the office and beyond, casting a pall over the company. Speculation ran wild, but no one suspected Mark. He returned to work, hollow and numb, keeping his head down as the police conducted their investigation. But the guilt gnawed at him, eroding what was left of his resolve. Weeks passed, and Emma and Mark tried to piece together the fragments of their broken lives. But the memory of that night haunted them both, a constant reminder of the darkness that had consumed them. Emma, burdened with guilt and shame, found herself unable to look at Mark the same way. And Mark, once so devoted, felt only emptiness where his love for her had once been. Eventually, the weight of his guilt became too much for Mark to bear. He went to the police, confessing everything, his voice steady as he recounted the events that had led him to kill Victor. The officers listened, their faces impassive, as Mark laid bare the truth. Emma watched as they took him away, her heart heavy with regret and sorrow. She knew that, in a way, she was just as responsible for what had happened. She'd allowed herself to be drawn in by Victor's charm, to be swept up in a forbidden thrill that had destroyed everything she held dear. The trial was swift, and Mark was sentenced to prison, his life reduced to a series of moments frozen in memory. Emma visited him once, her face etched with sorrow, but the distance between them was insurmountable. They both knew that the love they'd once shared was lost, buried beneath the weight of betrayal and violence. In the years that followed, Emma tried to rebuild her life, but the shadow of that night lingered. She threw herself into her work, hoping to find solace, but nothing could erase the memories of what had happened. Mark, alone in his cell, spent his days in silence, haunted by the choices that had led him down such a dark path. The love he'd sacrificed, the life he'd destroyed, all for a justice that, in the end, brought him only emptiness. Their story became a cautionary tale, whispered about in the corridors of Grayson and Keene, a reminder of how easily leaves could unravel when trust was broken and darkness allowed to fester. And for Mark and Emma, the memories of that night would remain forever etched in their minds, a tragic testament to the cost of betrayal and the devastating consequences of unchecked passion and revenge.